Hello, this is just a quick impromptu video about going through the process of a Debian GNU/Linux custom install. So we're going to be going to the advanced options on the installer, and we're going to go into Graphical Expert Install. I'm using a virtual machine for the purpose of this video, but the process of installing it on a physical computer should be about the same. Select English, select United Kingdom. Yep. We don't need a braille display because I'm not blind, but if you are, that's an option you would select. Don't really need a speech synthesizer. I'm gonna go configure the keyboard, British English, and then we're gonna go to detect and mount CD-ROM. Yep. And this is the image that I've downloaded from the internet, from the official Debian website. It has been officially detected by the installer, and the installation process will now begin. Press load installer components. So these are just the optional installer components. Out of all these, I just need to choose mirror, installer, and everything else not really necessary. Next, we're gonna detect network hardware. And then configure the network. And auto-configure networking is fine, unless of course you know who you are, you have needs to configure your network manually, but I'm just gonna go this, and then maximum time, leave that as the default. And hopefully that works. Has succeeded. Okay. Host name for the system, we're just gonna go Debian. Domain name, we don't really have a domain name, not necessary. Now we're gonna go to that component that we chose earlier, choose a mirror of the Debian archive. Now, to explain what this actually does is, the Debian archive is essentially the mirror of the repository that we're going to be downloading software from. So in the future, when we want to install programs, this is the mirror it will be downloaded from. And we have several protocols to choose from: HTTP, HTTPS, which is the more secure one, and FTP, which is, well, file transfer protocol. Pretty self-explanatory. I normally go for HTTP or FTP. I'm sure HTTPS is more secure because the S literally stands for secure and other reasons, but for the purposes of this, I'm just going to go with HTTP. And we're going to select United Kingdom because that's the closest one. So ftp.uk.debian.org is usually my choice, but as you can see, there's plenty different mirrors that you can select. We don't have a proxy, so we can leave that blank, but this is where you'd enter proxy information in this format. We're gonna go set up users and passwords. So shadow passwords, make your system more secure, blah blah blah. You can read all that. You may as well enable this, and then of course you're in a NIS environment or have some special requirements. This is a root account, so think of it as an administrator account on Windows. Root has a lot more access to the entire system, and generally things like installing programs will require root. However, you don't necessarily have to be able to use root as a user, as you can use the sudo command, which is super user do. Essentially means do as super user. But sometimes it's just much easier to have a root account so you can log in as a super user and do certain things that require super user account without having to type in the sudo command. So root password, definitely want to choose a strong one for this. So just do something like this and something like this. And then you want to create a normal user account. So we're just going to enter Debian. Yep. And your user password can be weak. I mean, I don't recommend it, but it's just easier in terms of convenience for when you're running super user commands, that you only have to enter this password as opposed to your whole super user password. Next step, configuring the clock. So we can use NTP, which usually just works, unless it doesn't. And we're gonna select Europe London, which just happens to be UTC. Then we're gonna detect disks. And next we're gonna partition disks. So here we're gonna select up guided use entire. So basically you can encrypt the entire disk using this option, which is very good because someone takes your computer, someone steals your laptop, or gains physical access to your drive, and they won't be able to get data off of it because it's encrypted. And here you can just use the entire disk. And LVM stands for Logical Volume Management. Not really necessary, but if you want to get encrypted, then that's the option you want to go for. And you of course have a manual option where you can select the partitions on your drive manually to, for example, say how big certain partitions have to be, etc. So for the purposes of this video, since I'm using a virtual machine and I already have that encrypted through VMware Workstation, you may as well just use guided use entire disk. But generally, encrypted LVM is the way you'd go to, but be wary that if you use the encrypted LVM option, every time you boot on your computer, you're going to have to type in the password that you're going to set in the encrypted LVM option. And that can be troublesome, especially because at that stage in the boot time, sometimes it won't recognize external keyboards on a laptop, for example, which means that you'll have to go to the laptop and use its internal keyboard to type in that password. And that can be a little annoying, but it's definitely worth it from a security perspective. However, this is just a simple tutorial, so we're going to go through the guided use entire disk option. So this is our VMware drive, 21.5 gigabytes. About what you want for this installation. Of course, if you're going to properly use it as a full-time computer, then I'd recommend somewhere around 120 gigs of storage. And this is a minimal install, so we're not going to be using a lot of that 21.5 gigabytes at all. However, Linux installations sometimes fail. The Debian installer in particular is extremely outdated, is just plain obsolete in certain aspects. So you want to make sure that you have about that much storage, and if not, then maybe look into using another distribution. So here you have several options, so I'm going to go through them. So the several options that you have here are all files in one partition, which is the recommended option for new users, or you can have a separate home partition. Now, actually, I recommend having a separate home partition because in case you bork your Windows install, Linux install, then you can simply copy that home partition, which is where you're going to be having your documents, your configuration files, your pictures, downloads, videos, etc. So all those things in the home partition. Very good in case you are experimenting with Linux and you still want to be able to use that as a computer that's reliable and you can rescue data off of it. So yeah, I think that's good. And essentially, if you use a separate home partition, then if you bork this install and create another and try to install again, you can use the manual partition menu that we've seen in the previous installer screens to not have a home partition and just use this home partition that's already on the drive. And you might get into a little hell with the permissions, especially if your username is different. It's going to complain that you don't have permissions for some of the folders, but that can be easily fixed through a set of commands, resetting the permissions for all the folders, etc. And then the last option is home, var, and temp partitions. I think if you need this option, then you know why you need it. So I'm not going to go through what this one really means. I'm going to go separate home partition. And here we have all the different things. So let me go through this. So this is the root partition. So we've set that as 8 gigabytes. This is essentially the root partition of our disk. This is where our application is going to be stored, etc. Various Linux files, etc. This is a swap partition. So the swap partition is equal or about equal to our RAM. This is when you run out of RAM, you simply go into the swap partition, which is kind of like the memory file on Windows, which the programs will go to if you run out of RAM. This is similar to that, works in a very similar way. And there we have our 13.3 gigabytes home partition. So we're going to select finish partitioning and write changes to disk and click continue. And then yes again. Then we're going to go install the base system. If you selected encrypted LVM in the option above and you're using something like a virtual drive like the VMware, or you're using an SSD, there's going to be, actually I'm going to go through the encrypted LVM option as well. Go through here, this, just detect them again, and then partition disks. I'm going to do undo changes to partitions, and then go here. So I'm going to go to the guided partitioning option in that previous menu, so here. And we're just going to use guided use entire disk and set up encrypted LVM. I'm going to SCSI1, that's how you pronounce that, SCSI, you pronounce that as SCSI. Here's a fun fact. So you go here and again separate home partition, things are the same. We're going to press continue. Now this is going to take a long time, and if you're on SSD, this is just wasting your write and read cycles, and eventually it will freeze. For me, it always freezes at about the halfway point, so you can just click cancel and the installation will continue. So here is where you select the encryption passphrase. So that's what I meant about the Debian installer being kind of outdated, in the sense that the wasting of SSD read and write cycles by that previous step is not really accounted for, as it's not even optional, but of course you can cancel out of it, which is still very good. So you're going to type in your password here and just click continue, and the rest of it is going to go about the same as in our other option. So here, just leave that as default. I think no reason to not. So here you can just leave this as default unless you really want to change this. This is usually going to be your username -VG, which stands for volume group. And then finish partitioning and write changes to disk. So, you know, we have LV now, which is for our logical volume management volume group, and this is logical volume, which is generally a good idea to have but not necessary. Then finally we're going on to the install the base system. And this is just going to be installing the base system. So at this stage, you're going to have to select which Linux kernel to install, because Linux, just by itself, is actually just the kernel, and GNU and the distributions are what provides the operating system experience, so to speak. So you can select either one, but I will just go with the default option. So here's an option. Targeted might be better if you're trying to go for a really minimal system, but including all available drivers might make it better in case you want to run this operating system on a different computer with different drives. So you take the drive out of your laptop, for example, and plug it into another, and you can boot this system. So I think that generic is probably alright. It's not, in my opinion, even going for a minimal system. Targeted, not worth it. Generic is just more versatile, but of course, if you really want to, you can always go for targeted. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just gonna go with generic. It's writing 4907 AMD 64. If in case you're new to computer stuff, AMD 64 doesn't actually mean you have an AMD processor or something like that. AMD 64 is just the name of the 64-bit architecture. It's done. Next step, configure the package manager. So your package manager is what's going to be dealing with installing software on your system, making sure that your software is up to date, upgrading that software when it's not up to date, removing software cleanly, making sure that there aren't any broken dependencies, etc. And again, if you're new to this, dependencies are like one program depends on a library, so you have to install that library. The bonus of this is that once you install that library, then every other program that depends on this library can just use it. So that's essentially the advantage this kind of system has over all-in-one programs, which all come with their specific libraries. But this also has the disadvantage of that ideally all the packages are kept up to date and will have the same versions of the libraries, so you don't have to install multiple versions, which is what you get with an all-in-one program that will feature all of its dependencies as part of itself. I'm going to configure the package manager. So the package manager that Debian uses is Apt. So we're going to select no, I don't have another CD or DVD. I'm going to select yes. Select HTTP, United Kingdom, FTP UK, HTTP proxy none. Okay, so this option allows you to download non-free software. So non-free means not paid, but free as in freedom, not free as in free beer. In this case, it means that proprietary software, so software for which source code is not available and users of the software cannot modify and look through the source code and examine it. Buy with non-free software. This option enables that software. Now, you can get by it's probably a good idea to enable it, because most likely you're going to have a Realtek or Atheros or Intel Wi-Fi adapter, and that's going to need proprietary firmware. So all this does is something you can undo later. So in any case, we're going to select yes, because that's what most people are going to need, unfortunately. And this is source repositories, so that Apt-Get and however, if you don't need this feature, you can disable those entries, basically what it says. So just leave them. I always leave them. no real reason to turn them off. It allows you to run the Apt-Get source command, which you might need in the future. So I'm just going to leave that on and be configuring apt. Now, if you're using one of those laptops with proprietary firmware, the chances are it's probably not going to load. So, yeah, unfortunately, you might not have internet connection, you might not have Wi-Fi connectivity to use here. In case with something like Ubuntu, it will come with the drivers that you most likely need and you will get Wi-Fi access. But just in case, if you're installing this on a physical computer, I'd keep an Ethernet cable handy, because Ethernet doesn't usually require drivers. A generic driver will suffice that's included in the installer. And then once you boot to the system, you can just install the firmware that you need yourself. So then we're going to go to the next step, select and install software. Another option that comes up is to participate in the package popularity contest, which essentially sends off anonymous statistics about the most used packages on the system. It is ultimately good to contribute to this package usage survey, because this means that the maintainers and contributors to the Debian distribution will know that some packages are more in demand than others, and they'll make more effort to upkeep those packages and keep them working and test them to make sure that they're working properly. But even if you select yes or no, you can run gpakg reconfigure popularity contest. Since this is just a VM for the purpose of this video, I'm going to select no. But if you're going to run it as a full operating system, there's no reason to select no. Now, here we go. So we're gonna, since we're doing a minimal install, we're gonna uncheck all of these. This is the desktops that you want to install, and if you select any of these, they're gonna download a lot of bloat on your system, which I personally don't like, so I'm not gonna select any of them. But I am going to select the SSH server and make sure standard system utilities is selected. So in that sense, we get something halfway between a full-on custom Arch Linux install and a more sane, more out-of-the-box Debian install. So this is all the software it's installing: Python, Perl, libraries, fonts, the basics, essentially. So after that's done, the next step is install the grub bootloader and a hard disk. So this is the step that you want to pay attention to in case you're running Windows and dual booting with Linux. So here is where it installs the grub bootloader, which is necessary to load Linux, and essentially this is what is going to be your bootloader now. If you install it, you can continue without it, but you really do kind of want it to use Linux with. You also have the option of using Lilo, but grub is usually the choice, the bootloader of choice. So the next thing that we're going to see is, seems that this nuanced installation operating system is the only one on the computer. If so, it seems it's safe to install to the master boot record of your hard drive. So basically what this says, if the installer failed to detect another operating system, usually if you have Windows on your drive, then you will probably be fine, and it will detect it and write it to the grub bootloader to make sure that you can boot both your Windows or whatever operating system and Linux at the same time. But if it shows you this message and you do have Windows installed side by side, then it has failed to detect it. So it's not catastrophic, but you will need to make sure that to later manually configure grub to ensure that you can boot your Windows install again. So temporarily it will be unbootable. So since it's the only operating system here, we're just going to go yes to install it to the master boot record. And we're just going to select dev SDA, which is our main drive. I'm just going to say no. It depends on what you really want to use, EFI or just a normal. Well, we're gonna select no. In most cases you can probably boot fine, but this is a nice fallback in case you do have an EFI system that won't boot grub. Next step, finish the installation. And we're done. So we're gonna press continue, and I'm just gonna eject. So here we see the decryption screen. So here's where you're gonna enter your encryption password. And there we go. We've got Debian Linux installed, custom install, no desktop, nothing like that. So we're just gonna log in with our username and password. The password won't show when you enter it. That's fine. That's a security feature. Don't worry about it. Just type it in blind and hit enter. It should work just fine. Alright, so we have a couple adjustments to make before we can really get to a desktop. So first thing I'd like to do is to test if my user is in the sudo list. So we're just gonna type sudo, typo, sudo, so command not found. So we definitely have a problem here. So we're gonna log in as super user. Here you enter your super user password, and now we're logged in as super user. So I'm gonna check if apt is installed. Apt is installed. So we're gonna install the program sudo. For some reason it didn't install, even though it's a core Linux utility, but if you get the same error, that is how you fix that. So to exit the root, we type in exit, and we go back to our normal user, and then we type in sudo, and you see the usage of it. So we're gonna try to run sudo Apt-Get update. Now what this command does is it pulls from the server, from the repository mirror that we selected, the lists of packages and other information, so that this is how we store it in our system in the offline cache, so that we know what is available to us to install. So I'm just gonna try to run that. Apt is our package manager, get is the operation, so and update doesn't really matter. It usually achieves the same thing, but in case one of them fails, the other one will succeed. And I apologize for that very loud beep. That's the VMware simulating a PC speaker. By the way, when you're going to start up this installation, that's exactly the sound it's going to make, either on your physical laptop or computer PC speaker, or through your headphones, completely obliterating your eardrums like in VMware. So just be wary of that. So sudo password for Debian. We're gonna type in our password. This is our user password, not the super user password. And there we go. Debian is not in the sudoers file. This incident will be reported. Now, this is kind of a pain in the backside, but it's not a hard fix. So this is the command that we need to type up. So the command that we need to run is again a super user. So we're gonna type in su, which is the command to log in as super user. We're gonna type up our super user password, and then we're going to go just a typo, so it's actually lowercase a, capital G. And that should have worked, maybe. One way to test it is we're gonna go exit again, and then sudo who am I. And again, we're not in the sudoers file. You can log out and log back in and see if that works. I just reboot because that seems to work much more consistently. So I'm gonna go into super user again, and the command we need to type is reboot, though of course you can just shut down your computer and turn it on again. You can select Debian GNU/Linux and unlock our drive. Again, the password won't show, it's a security feature, so don't worry about it. Alright, and let's try that again. And then the command we need to run is sudo who am I. Who am I identifies who you are as a user. So I'm gonna enter the password, and we see root. So sudo gives us root powers, which is what we want. Now we're gonna run apt-get update, and we're gonna be, yeah, that's all. So we don't have many sources at the moment to get packages from, but that is all we need for now. So there's a couple of things that you probably want to install before you even get to a desktop. So one of those would be your Wi-Fi firmware, although you can just as well install that after get on the desktop. But there are several desktop environments you can choose from, or you can even go for a window manager like i3. However, as this is meant to be a tutorial for someone who's a relative beginner, I'm going to go with Cinnamon. Cinnamon is a great desktop choice. It is good looking, and it's got a lot of optimization to it, which makes it resource efficient. So we're gonna, so to search packages, you would type in Sudo Apt Search, and we're just gonna go Cinnamon, and we have a whole lot of stuff, and we're not able to scroll up in this environment, so we're gonna typing in something like Cinnamon Core. There we go. Essential components. That's exactly what we want. And we type that in, install. We don't have to use the get. You can remove that. It's really up to you. If one fails, try the other. It's kind of my philosophy. So yeah, sudo apt install cinnamon core, and if we run that, sudo running a execute command as super user, so super user do, apt is our package manager, install is the operation we want to perform, so install that package, and cinnamon core is the name of the package that we want to install. So hit enter, and boom, 994 of additional disk space. That's all the dependencies. So I'm gonna install that and just wait until it finishes. Might take a while. Jump cut. So once that's done, we enter a command called sudo reboot. So again, super user do reboot, and we reboot. Again, you can just shut down your computer, but this is a more clean way to do it. And immediately we're presented with a more graphical version of the menu. We're just going to select Debian /Linux. And again, we're going to type in our password for the decryption of our encrypted drive. Don't worry about those warnings and errors. Unless it fails to boot, it's really nothing to worry about. And yeah, here we go. This is what's called a login manager. So you can install a different one if you want, but since this is a short tutorial about how to get to a minimal install with a graphical desktop, I've just went with the Cinnamon default one. You can also install a different one later on, and this is essentially what manages your graphical session. So it manages you logging in, so we can type in username and password, and we can log in here, or we can cancel to select a different user. Here we have accessibility features, power options. So here we have a language selection for the keyboard, and if you have multiple desktop environments installed in the future, or a window manager, say like i3 and Cinnamon, this is the option you would go to select it. You can also go software rendering if you don't have a proper GPU. So we click login and we wait because yeah, so it's running in software mode because it's a virtual machine without VMware tools or anything installed, so it makes sense. So wired is unmanaged, that's fine because, as I said, generic driver for Ethernet. So you're probably asking yourself, if we were going to install a desktop anyway, why didn't we just go with the option in the installer? Well, the reason for that is all sorts of issues that we would, all sorts of bloated software that we would have. So for now, we only really have the very minimal amount of software here. So all of these things, basically a necessity for a full desktop environment. I don't really consider them bloat. Accessories, archive manager, files. If you were to install this with the option install in the installer, it wouldn't install the Cinnamon core package, it would install the full Cinnamon package, which includes things like games and office applications you probably don't want. All those things, well, you don't want if, you know, if you're someone who doesn't want them. Not really sure where I was going with that, but yeah. So these are the terminals, so we're gonna have to use that for a little more. So Xterm is a good start, but as you can see, it's kind of ugly looking and doesn't have the functionality. So what we're gonna do is Sudo Apt Search, and then you can Google on your other computer or something about, you know, different terminal applications you can install, or you can actually go ahead and install a browser. So in this example, I'm going to be installing Chromium, and as you can see, we can actually scroll up here, which makes this much more usable than the pure terminal shell that we had before. So this is the package we want, Chromium. So we're just going to type in sudo apt install Chromium, and there we go. And there we go. So you can go now on the internet using the Chromium web browser. Since this only has 512 megabytes of RAM, it's gonna take a while, and you know, it's just Google Chrome or Chromium. It's the same thing. You probably know what it is, so I'm not really gonna take time to show you around it. You can sign in, you can go to all these helpful bookmarks like help, etc. So I'm just going to close out of that. And the terminal application that I'm going to install is called Terminator. There we go. So now we can close out of this terminal. And if we go to the menu, you will see that we now have Terminator right here. And like this, we can go to the menu and we type in Terminator, brings it up. You can just pin it right here, so it's easy access. Gonna go here, and as you can see, it looks much nicer. So next thing I would say to install is just some basic utilities. So for example, you can search a file manager for the terminal. That's something I use, probably not something a lot of people use, as people tend to prefer graphical file managers, which is, by the way, right here. Application called Files. It's actually called Nemo, but it's Files for the sake of simplicity. And here you can browse all your things. So just a few basic things. So first of all, actually I'm going to install an image viewing program called FE, which is a very minimal, very bare bones image viewing program, but it's very versatile. It's something I highly recommend. So we're just gonna press Y. If it says, do you want to continue, Y/N, you just type in Y and then press enter. It's something I kind of glossed over, but it's something I think is fairly intuitive if you used a CLI before, CLI command line interface. So now we've got FE, so if we were to download an image off the internet, we could open it with FE. Now you probably want something like a video player, so we're gonna Sudo Apt Search VLC, for example, commonly known software. So got a whole bunch, and there we go, VLC, the package. So sudo apt install VLC. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to install a graphical package manager for deb files. That's something you're going to encounter if you're going to install something like Skype or Google Chrome as opposed to Chromium, which is going to come in a .deb file, which is kind of like the executable installer for Windows. So to be able to manage that, by default they will open in the archive manager and you will just see the contents of it, but that's not really what you want. What you want is to be able to use that package manager to install these packages on your system. So what we're gonna do is just sudo apt search gdebi is the thing we want, so it's right there. Install gdebi. That's GNOME deb something. So we're going to install that, and then you probably want a text editor. A lot of Linux programs are configured not by a graphical user interface, but by a simple text file which just tells you which options you can change. So if you're a gamer, for example, you're probably familiar with this with .ini file editing, where you would go into the game settings file and just manually input the options you want, like the resolution or grass draw distance for like Skyrim, etc. So this is similar. So we're going to install a text editor. I'm going to install two. So one I'm going to install is a terminal text editor called Nano. Oh, it's already installed. Must be a core Linux util, but in any case it's fairly useful if you want something really, really basic. But if we want something graphical, then we're going to install, if we want something graphical, we're going to install Gedit. So there we go. Yes. And it's installed. So let's say Gedit, and we have our Gedit thing. Now another thing you probably should familiarize yourself with is bash scripts. So for example, this is a basic bash script, so that's just something I'm writing, but you'll find those on the internet for certain programs which are just simple bash scripts, etc. So at the top there usually will be a hash sign followed by an exclamation mark. That's the hash bang, as it's called in the industry, so to speak, and then Just gonna type in simple command echo hello world. And we're gonna save that by pressing Ctrl S, or you can click the save button. They both do the same thing. So we're just gonna rename that as like hello world. We can type in the extension sh, but which is what most bash scripts are gonna be found with, but that's actually not necessary. But we're gonna leave that for now. You see highlighting automatically because of the sh format. I'm gonna exit, and then to list the files in a directory, the command you want to use is ls. So that immediately shows up our home directory where our script is. So right now, if we try to execute it, nothing's gonna happen. So what we need to do is type in chmod +x hello world.sh. And if we type in ls again, you see that's highlighted in green, meaning it's now executable. What that command did was to give executable permissions to that script, allowing it to be executed. So now, if we type in ./hello world.sh, it prints hello world, just like our script was supposed to. Now, if you want to clear the terminal, if you ever get overwhelmed, you can just type in clear, press enter, and all the previous text will be cleared. Now, another thing you might want to do is to figure out how to change directories in the terminal. So that would be cd and then downloads, for example. And if you want to go up a directory, you type in cd ... and then if you want to go to the root directory, you type in cd/. If you want to go to your home directory, which is where we were just before, where all your documents and stuff are, you type in the tilde key and then /, and you're back here again. So here's another nice tip. So if you don't want to type in the full name of something, then you can simply type cd do, for example, and then you press tab, and that's going to show you all the options for that. So it's a good reminder in complex folder structures of what you have in there. And if you press down, for example, or just DOW and type in tab, it auto completes it for you. And yeah, so it's a fairly useful thing. And that pretty much concludes it. We've got an image viewer program, we've got a video editor, we've got file manager, we've got a web browser, and a terminal that is a very neat looking one with lots of good features such as split tabs, etc. So yeah, so as far as I'm concerned, I think that this is where the tutorial should end. And as a final little thing, I guess we should install sudo apt install neofetch, which is a neat image, which is a neat information program. So we're just gonna install so we're just gonna type in neofetch, and there we go. We've got all the information about our system in the palm of our hand. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. Bye.